In way less time than you typically spend scrolling for something to watch every night, I'm going to tell you about 10 of the best movies currently included with Max that are loaded with sex. But these are actually all excellent movies that I highly recommend. They just got some strong sexual themes in them, starting with my number 10 pick, which admittedly is the lowest rated movie on this list. That's often how it goes. But in Pathology, you follow a group of young, medical hotshots that are all working in this city morgue, and they start running some experiments, but these aren't like Dr. Frankenstein science fiction experiments. These are really macabre, dark experiments, and these young, hot medical professionals are having a lot of sex with each other. Yes, often in the morgue, so the movie's disturbing enough with its major themes, and then they add some pretty graphic sexual elements on top of that, again, taking place in the morgue. This is a fairly intense movie, but it ends up going a little bit too hard in the paint, and I think that might be why it has so many negative reviews, is it doesn't feel very believable, but the trade-off there is you get just a wild medical thriller. Next up, we've got an HBO original movie from the 90s that still holds up today, in fact, surprisingly well, with one of Angelina Jolie's first movies, Gia. Now, this is based on a famous fashion model from the 1980s named Gia, and it's actually based on some of her journal writings and interviews with people, and they do a fantastic job in this movie blending those things together. Angelina Jolie is not only great as this character, and it is a kind of a bold, wild character. It really shaped her career, but this movie feels somewhat uniquely accurate, and at the very least, it feels like it kind of respects the real Gia fairly well. Even though her story is a pretty rough one, not only does this movie feature a fully nude Angelina Jolie through a lot of the movie, but it also just has a lot of heavy sexual themes. And for the late 90s, some of the stuff they're doing in this movie is pretty wild, especially considering, I know it's HBO, but this is technically a made-for-TV movie, and it is a raunchy one. My next pick comes from legendary Spanish director Pedro Almodovar and stars Antonio Banderas. I've got one very close to the number one spot from the same director, also starring Antonio Banderas. But in Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, he plays a mentally deranged man who is recently released from an institution, and his first move as a free man is to kidnap a porn star that he's obsessed with, hold her captive until she falls in love with him. And I can tell you, even if you're not into that synopsis, which is kind of a wild one, the movie itself actually delivers a lot. There's a huge spectrum of emotion that's conveyed really well through this movie. Some tense moments, some happy moments, some sad stuff, and it's all done with this incredibly vibrant color palette. This movie almost reminded me a little bit of Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange in the way that it uses these bold colors and sort of stark camera angles. I actually really love the aesthetic of this movie, and I gotta say, in a list full of sex, meaning there's a sex scene or two or three in every movie on this list, Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, I think features my favorite, and unlike some of the other movies on this list, it's not gratuitous. It is graphic, it's extremely graphic, but it serves the story, meaning the movie actually earns it. There's a reason it's supposed to be in there, and it drives things forward and makes a lot of things actually work quite well. This one is from Spain. You will have to read subtitles, but if you don't like reading subtitles, honestly, this movie's probably not going to be for you anyway. The same goes for my next pick, which is actually the Frenchiest French movie I've ever seen. It also happens to be one of the most culturally significant movies about BDSM. It's the godfather of BDSM movies, The Piano Teacher. This movie swept the Cannes Film Festival, winning all the best prizes. They actually had to make a rule to not give so many of the top prizes to movies in the future because of this film. Now, this is not really a sexy one either. The story follows a very sexually repressed piano teacher, and as you follow her, she gets up to some weird stuff, some baffling things, to be honest. I was actually so confused watching a few of the scenes in this movie, I went to go look up what was actually happening, and a lot lot of other people were equally as confused. But her and one of her students slowly fall in love. There's a big age gap, but once this movie hits the midpoint, it has multiple eyebrow-raising moments in it. And ultimately, it's actually pretty sad. Like I said, not really a sexy one, although this one, for a list of movies full of sex, this one has the most graphic elements in it out of anything else you could watch on this list. But by far. I should say, if you feel the need to Google what BDSM means, this movie is most likely going to be way too intense for you. All right, next up, we've got just a classic thriller from the 90s. And I mean, the 90s had some seriously sexy thrillers, you know, Basic Instinct, Fatal Attraction, but the one that made this list, because it's available on Max right now, is Single White Female.
You've got to be kidding.
Now, this one was a hit when it was released, but time has kind of forgotten it. It has not been remembered as well as some of those other 90s thrillers I mentioned, but I think it's every bit as good. And it stars two women who would go on to become Quentin Tarantino alum, with Bridget Fonda and Jennifer Jason Leigh. Fonda plays a somewhat successful woman who takes on a roommate played by Lee, who ends up becoming an incredibly obsessive person. If you've never seen this movie, there's a good chance you've seen a setup like this before, but honestly, Single White Female kinda does it the best, and like I said, it ends up being like a true blue 90s thriller, which are, you know, often pretty fantastic. Next up, we've got a road movie that isn't loaded with sex, not nearly as much as the other movies on this list, but when they do show it, it is fairly graphic in American Honey. Now, what's more graphic than the sex in this movie is just the look at poverty in America. It's not a deep look, in fact, it's kind of a passive look. This movie feels a lot like a documentary, not exactly, but it has that kind of feel. At the same time, it does have some stunning cinematography, and honestly, one of Shia LaBeouf's best performances. He's absolutely amazing in this movie. He feels so natural, and he's acting alongside some folks that are not actors that feel too natural, yet he manages to blend with them amazingly well. It's really impressive in this movie, but you're actually following an 18-year-old girl who's a runaway. I know it's kind of hard to run away at age 18, but she hooks up with this band of runaway misfits, and they sell magazines all over the country, and it's a rough crew. Sasha Lane is the lead. This is one of her first roles, even though she was just recently in Twisters, and she's great. She carries the movie. I mean, it's literally on her shoulders. But as far as road movies go, I would rank this one way above this year's Civil War. I think it has a lot more to say about a lot of different things and is much more thought-provoking, even though it doesn't really have any action in it at all. And next up, we've got the newest release on this list, a brand new movie that just got added to Max. It's the only place you can currently catch it in the US unless you want to rent it. By the way, I did list out a few other streaming services hosting these movies, but typically when they're on Max in the US, they're not really found anywhere else. But down in that top pinned comment, I also listed where you can stream these in Canada, the UK, and Australia. So if you live somewhere else or don't have Max, and maybe you have access to a VPN, check that top pinned comment. You'll have more luck finding these titles. But Love Lies Bleeding comes in at number 4, just behind a David Lynch flick and the other Pedro Almodovar flick. This takes place in the 90s. Kristen Stewart plays an insanely butch lesbian in this movie who falls for a bodybuilder. This is directed by Rose Glass, who previously did Saint Maud, another movie I've recommended here for art house movie lovers. And Love Lies Bleeding is a really cool flick that kind of feels, again, like a 90s thriller, almost like early Coen brothers, like Blood Simple or something like that. It's got a cool soundtrack. Ed Harris looks like a madman in this movie. Dave Franco has a really gross mullet. There's a lot to love with this movie, but the thing I liked the most was just the vibe. Now, it does make the list. There are some really intense sex scenes in this movie, more than one. They're a bit gratuitous in this movie, I'll be honest, but there is a point to them. But overall, I just thought this was a really slick flick with some killer cinematography, some twists and turns I didn't see coming, and some truly unique characters. Some characters I feel like I'd never seen in a movie before, and not just from the main two leads. Again, Ed Harris, there's another lesbian girl in the mix that I thought was really funny and kind of obnoxiously charming. Just a fairly well fleshed out movie that, again, feels fresh, but also has that 90s thriller vibe that I tend to really enjoy, if you can't tell. But then my number 3 pick is officially the last feature film from director David Lynch. It's titled Inland Empire. Now this one, if you have not seen it, I'm definitely not going to spoil anything. I don't know that I could spoil anything if I wanted to with this movie, but it has a lot in common with Mulholland Drive, a little bit in common with Lost Highway, and it's all filmed on videotape and has a very coarse look as a result. This is not a pretty movie. In fact, it's fairly ugly from the very start all the way to the finish. And it's somewhat done on purpose, also done to kind of strip the movie down from all its gloss and glamour. It does work. It is a solid 3 hours. I mean, it's longer than The Dark Knight, and most of it feels like it's depicting a fever dream. In fact, every single time in this movie, and I mean every time, I felt like I was starting to understand what he was saying in a given scene. Something dramatic happened that completely confused me, and I was lost once again. I watch a lot of movies. There are other creators that try to do stuff like this, and it just ends up being kind of a weird mess. And somehow, I don't understand it, but somehow David Lynch is able to make a weird mess totally mess with your mind, and I love him for that. Now, if you've never really gotten into David Lynch, I strongly suggest that you do not make Inland Empire your first attempt to watch a David Lynch movie. I think you're going to be more than lost. But if you've liked some of his other flicks, I don't see Inland Empire available very often, which is why I was excited to be able to recommend it here on Max. It's the first time I think I've ever talked about it here on the channel. One I have not talked about in quite a while is that other Antonio Banderas flick from the same director as Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down. This one is newer, somewhat newer. It's about 10 years old now, but it's titled The Skin I Live In. And I'll say this movie would probably not get made today. In this movie, Banderas plays a brilliant plastic surgeon who is experimenting with like a new kind of like almost indestructible skin. What he ends up doing, and the reason I don't think they would have made this anymore, is essentially the main plot. He gets revenge on a man by essentially turning him into a woman via plastic surgery. I mean, in this movie, it is depicted as a form of torture and punishment. Again, I just do not think filmmakers, movie makers would even get caught dead doing that today. But this ends up being a wild thriller. It's also got some like Spanish melodrama elements mixed in, just like Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down did. And this too has kind of a weird, sterile, Stanley Kubrick type feeling to it. It's a little creepy, it's a lot weird, it's also funny at times, and also pretty macabre at the same time. This one goes to darker places than Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, but it does them all really effectively, which is why it's my number 2 pick. Now, if you came to this video just hoping for a movie with a lot of hot sex in it, my number 1 pick has the least amount out of anything on this list, so I'll actually point you to Killing Me Softly. This stars Heather Graham and features a bunch of wild sex scenes with her, and it's a twisted thriller that boasts a commendable 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, mainly because of how bonkers the final twist is in this movie. But if you want a solid flick that is gonna get into your bones, I recommend The Eyes of My Mother. Now, this is kind of like an art house version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, almost. The story essentially follows a young woman who's raised out on this secluded farm where she bears witness to some horrific things in her young age and ends up being a very poorly adjusted young woman. This ultimately leads to a few scenes of sexual tension, but at the same time, you're also dealing with some insanely dark elements, and not in a traditional way. The main character here is not this maniacal, bloodthirsty killer, but again, rather this mentally disturbed young woman who, again, just doesn't quite realize what she's doing or what her place in the world is. And the filmmaking here is absolutely breathtaking. This is a horror movie. It's rare for one to feel this artsy and this effective at the same time. A weird pick, yes, but when you watch it, I think you'll know why it made the list and why it made my number 1 pick. But I will warn you again, This is not one that's going to be for those of you with a weak stomach, I promise you. But that is the list. If you like the idea of never running out of good movies to watch again, definitely consider clicking that subscribe button, or go to DarrenVanDam.com. You can sign up for my free newsletter. I protect all your information. I don't let anybody else get to it. I send you one email a week with 5 movie recommendations, but I will keep making these videos as long as y'all keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Max episode, and you will see me on the next one.